Hello. It's a good day for a story. There's fresh snow falling outside the window. It's piling up higher and higher. We haven't had this much snow all winter long, and here we are in the first few days of spring, sucked in. So a story for today. It's a story, a retelling of a story by Hans Christian Andersen, a story that's been told thousands and thousands of times, and most recently heard by me in a telling from a young girl named Nour from Gaza. So this is a retelling of Nour's story. Once upon a time, once upon a place, on a mountaintop surrounded by forest, there was a castle, and in this castle lived a family, a large family. Their eldest daughter, who we shall call Nour, and her 11 brothers. That's right, 11 brothers. Now, their mother had passed away, and for this they were very sad, and they missed their mother greatly. And their father, the king, missed his wife. And time passed, and oh, they still tried to cheer each other up and had a good time. They loved to play in the orchard. They loved to watch the sun set, and they loved to tell jokes. Well, eventually the king decided he would marry again. He felt this would be the best for everyone. And the children were very excited and wanted to welcome the new queen, who would be like a mother to them. And they did everything they could to make her feel right at home. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, the new queen would have none of it. She did not like these children, and from the very start, conceived of ways to be rid of them. She was quite jealous of their affection the king had for them. So the first thing she did was to essentially take Nour away to a cottage nearby where Nour would live. She was old enough to live by herself, just barely. And then within days, she cast a magic spell, a very dark sort of magic, and she turned all 11 boys, the brothers, into wild swans, and away they flew. And from then on, the spell would be that by day they were swans, and at night they would come to rest as human boys. Well, Nour in the cottage did not hear of this until one day she was walking in the forest and a fairy popped out from behind a tree and told her what had happened. And she wasn't sure she believed the fairy because, you know, fairies like to tell tall tales, so they do. So Nour went to the castle to see for herself, and she did not find her brothers in all the places that they might be, either sleeping or playing or eating in the dining hall. And so it must be true. This made her very sad indeed, for what would she do to help her brothers? Well, that night, in a dream, that same fairy came back to her and said, my dear, my dear, my dear, there is one way to break the spell. You must knit 11 shirts for your brothers. But first, you must gather nettles, and from the nettles, spin the thread. And with the thread, you'll knit the shirts. And then the most important thing is, as you're gathering nettle, as you're spinning the nettle, and as you're knitting the shirts, you must not speak. For if you speak, well, it won't work. And this will be the only chance you have to break the spell. Whew. Well, when Nour woke up, she thought this was quite a dream. This was quite a task, but she was up for it. She was determined. She was brave and strong and clever. And so after she had her breakfast, away she went to the nettle patch, which she knew there was a large patch of nettle growing in the cemetery. And all day long she harvested and harvested the nettles. And the very next day she began to spin the nettle. And she did all of this in silence, which was easy enough because there was nobody there to talk to. And for 7 days and 7 nights, she spun thread from the nettle plants. And on the morning of the 8th day, there was a knock on the door. And she opened the door, and there stood a young man. It was a prince who had lost his way, perhaps in the forest, and was inquiring about how to get through the forest. And of course, Nour couldn't speak to him. So she pointed and she shrugged her shoulders, and she did her best to communicate with your hands and her face. And the prince was curious. Who was this girl in this cottage deep in the woods? And what was she doing? Spinning nettle? Well, she made some gesture that this was a very important task, and she nodded her head when he asked questions. And the prince deduced that she was indeed doing something very important. So he said, if you can point the direction out of this great forest, you will come. You're welcome to come to my castle, where you will have a room and everything you need to spin all you need. Well, Nour thought that this would perhaps be an easier path, and in her heart, she thought this would be the best course of action. And so that's what happened. She led the prince out of the forest, and he brought her to his castle. And his parents, the king and queen of this place, welcomed her, and she never spoke a word. And she had her very own space to spin, and she continued to spin. And then after a bit, she began to knit. And she knitted day and night and night and day, and she knitted and she knitted and she knitted, and still not a word, not a giggle, not a sound. It was harder than you think, especially with people around. Now, she realized that she didn't have enough thread, so she would need to go get more nettle. So away through the forest she went. She went back to the patch that she knew would be there at that old cemetery. Now, some of the prince's ministers were a tad bit jealous of Nour, because she seemed to have such a privileged place and not a word would come from her. So one of the ministers followed Nour into the forest and saw her gathering nettles from the cemetery. He thought this quite strange and indeed perhaps dangerous, at least in his mind. So Nour returned. She did not know the minister had been watching her, and the minister returned to the castle and in the morning told the prince. Well, the prince was confused and thought perhaps he didn't know what to think. And he tried to talk to Nour, but she couldn't speak. She was busy spinning and trying to finish the project so that she could find her brothers and pass on each of these shirts to each of her brothers. Her understanding was that this would break the spell. But the prince was now suspicious because the ministers had dropped that suspicion in his head. And perhaps because he wasn't a very bright man, or perhaps he was just young and naive and not sure what to believe, he told the princess she must leave. Well, she gathered all of her knitting and all of the thread she had and all of the nettle she had and her spindle, and away she went. And she found a safe place in the forest. And she continued. And now she was nearly done when one night, what should come flying over her head in the forest but 11 swans? And they landed, and Nour watched as they shifted shape from beautiful white swans into, yes, that's right, into her brothers. She still did not speak. She knew she couldn't speak. She'd been silent for so long. But she threw the shirts to them, and she was almost finished with one. It didn't quite have the full sleeve, but she tossed it to her brothers anyways. And after that, she still didn't risk speaking. Now, the next morning, around the time when the swans would usually return to their swan form, they didn't. And that's when Nour knew the spell had worked. Now, her one brother that had the partial sleeve that hadn't been completed, well, he still had a swan's wing instead of an arm. But nonetheless, it was a wonderful reunion, and there was loads of laughter. And turns out the prince, feeling perhaps not so good about his choice to send Nour out into the forest, went looking, and he found her with her brothers. And she explained everything, and the prince understood. And by now, he really realized that he was in love with the princess. Well, she wasn't a princess yet. He was in love with Nour and asked her to be his wife. And she agreed. And together, Nour and her 11 brothers and the young prince made their way back to the castle. And there, they say, they lived happily ever after, until they didn't. The end.